just discovered this little pamphlet that I wrote a couple of years ago. I'd forgotten all about it. Just skipping through the pages, it's full of the most bold, challenging ideas. I'd never tell anyone about these face to face. I'd be embarrassed, but I can write them, and I can read them. It's just a little pamphlet. It's like 20 pages. It comes in 12 chapters. I thought I'd read them one by one, and we can discover them together. All right? Open it up. 1. The revolution. It's already starting. Every once in a long while, how we think goes through a revolution. Ancient paganism gave way to Christianity, okay. Christianity gave way to modern science, okay. Modern science. That revolution happened 4 centuries ago. Aren't we due for another? The premise of this little book is, yes, we're due for another revolution in how we think. And here it is. Or, if you're not yet ready for a revolution, you might at least welcome another way of thinking to compare with how you think now. Don't we understand something better when we have more than one way of thinking about it? After 4 centuries of science's success, why am I urging on a revolution? Because science's account of human nature is incomplete. True, it can describe in magnificent detail how our bodies work in terms of physics and chemistry. But the more magnificent the detail, the more precisely we can judge what it omits that we want to understand. I express that as 2 questions. Why do I experience myself as not being purely physical? And what can my having conscious experiences tell me about my place in the universe? If you want answers to these questions, this little book is for you. We won't get those answers from today's science, he says. Today's science has hardened into a rigid doctrine called physicalism. Spokespersons for physicalism want to deflect our attention away from these questions. There's nothing to explain, they tell us. Despite us having conscious experiences, we're purely physical, as determined by physical laws as everything else in the universe. Our experience is that during consciousness we can be creative is just an illusion. Evolution seeming to be creative is also an illusion, they tell us. Their preferred mechanism, Neo-Darwinism, is purely physical, entirely bound by physical laws. What they're saying is, we have no option but to simply submit ourselves to the world's purely physical processes. Fatalism. So we live in 2 worlds, a world bound by the laws of physics, and for how to manage being conscious and creative, traditional wisdom with quite different implications. To answer my 2 questions, I've come up with an explanation, rational and scientific in its way. We'll see about that. that presents conscious experiences as being as real as anything physical. I set myself two conditions. Avoid discussing consciousness in physicalist terms. Baked into those terms is consciousness doesn't exist. Establish some kind of reality where consciousness can exist. There's no point in looking for it in the physical and quantum worlds as physicalists conceive of them. Oh. How we go on from there comes down to personal ingenuity. Must it be scientific? I say no. I say humanists have as much right to chime in as anyone. This is about us, all about human nature itself. What qualifies me to be your guide? I've had one professional career as a science and medical writer, another as a graphic designer. I've published a survey of evolutionary theory as it applies to mind in evolution as assessed through reviews of major texts. I've also written 2 novels, a play, and created several videos. I'm a creature of both worlds, the sciences and the humanities. That could be what you need to come up with a new origin story. Ready? Let's play the revolution game. Chapter 2. 4 real worlds. My first starting condition: avoid use of physicalist terminology. That I've already undertaken. My second, establish a kind of reality consciousness can exist in. Here goes. There's just one stuff in the universe. What happens is, over time, out of that original stuff emerge successive worlds, each seeming to come with its own properties and processes. It's the same stuff, just with different properties and processes. One is the quantum world. Stuff in the quantum world consists of particles and fields. They come with properties such as uncertainty and processes such as quantum entanglement. All very mysterious and hard to comprehend. Out of that, in turn, emerges the physical world. We're more familiar with that. It's entirely unlike the quantum world. Its stuff comes as chemical elements. Its properties include things like mass and electricity happen deterministically. Whatever happens depends on what's happened before, as determined by the laws of physics. So in a purely physical world, there can't be any real novelty or creativity. We know all about this world from the scientific revolution that started 4 centuries ago. Out of the physical world, in turn, emerges a world of life. Its stuff coming as the tissues of living creatures' bodies. It's distinguished by processes such as new kinds of creatures evolving and embryos growing into adults. How different is that world, the living world, from the physical world? You can get a sense of that by comparing the 2 planets, Mars and Earth. Mars is grimly brown, he says, lifeless, unchanging over billions of years. Earth is a lively blue because of its oceans, but also green. The green is a sign of change, of vitality, of life. It's life that makes the Earth so different from Mars. And out of the world of life, in turn, comes a world of mind. Mind is where you find ideas like matter and life. There's no such thing as matter in the physical world, only specific instances of matter. Ideas like matter exist only in our minds. It's a world of meanings, ideas, and messages, and processes like thinking and deciding. All these worlds consist of the same basic stuff, so they can interact with one another. What happens in each world will happen in the others as well, but through different processes. Choose to raise your arm to demonstrate you have free will, and in the physical world, physical matter corresponding to your arm moves deterministically due to the laws of physics. This, in turn, overwhelms uncertainty to cause change in the quantum world. Ultimately, of course, it's all the same stuff. What changes is the set of concepts we use to account for it. It's how we apply those concepts that make up distinct realms of reality. 4 different realities: quantum, physical, living, and mental. Entirely different, but able to interact with one another. Chapter 3: The World of Life. The world of life is so different from the material and quantum worlds that it qualifies as a world on its own. What makes it so different, first of all, is how differently stuff comes organized in it. Count the ways, he says. First, while physical stuff comes as many different chemical elements, living stuff consists of just a few, mostly oxygen, hydrogen, carbon and nitrogen, plus traces of a dozen or so others. What's more important to life than the kinds of atoms it's made of is how those atoms mostly come arranged as complex molecules consisting of hundreds, thousands, even billions of atoms strung together. It's as if these molecules were written messages. And they are. Written into them are ways of satisfying a living creature's needs. Living stuff comes as messages. Second, stuff in the living world comes bundled into distinct organisms. In each one, stuff comes organized from the top down, from the whole body level right down to the molecules at the bottom. What happens at the molecular level is driven by what the whole body is doing. For example, when we exercise, we drive changes in muscles and bones right down to the molecular level. Third, the stuff an organism is made of gets replaced by new stuff every so often, yet the organism stays looking much the same, going on living as before. So how an organism is organized isn't due to the stuff it's made of. It's due to something in the organism itself. Not only that, but each living whole is different from all the others, even among similar creatures of the same kind. What you learn about one, you can't necessarily apply to another. So rather than thinking of living creatures as physical objects, it's better to think of them as separate persons. Another way the world of life is so different from the physical world is how life changes. Physical matter doesn't change much over time. Whatever happens to it is determined by the invariable laws of physics. But living stuff changes all the time, resulting in streams of novelties such as the world would otherwise never see. One distinctive way life changes lies in how it grows. For example, a human embryo, single cell, can grow into an adult made up of trillions of cells of hundreds of different types, all organized into different kinds of tissue. Yet it's all under tight control, while we're still floating effortlessly in the womb like a fish in water. Our muscles attach themselves to bones precisely where they have to, so when we leave the womb, they'll hold us up against gravity and enable us to walk and run, completely unlike a fish. Organisms also come able to repair themselves if something goes wrong. Sometimes that's by a different process from how it grew in the first place. For example, when a fish loses the lens of an eye, the replacement lens may grow out of a different tissue from the tissue it grew from originally, involving a different set of stages. And of course, living creatures evolve. Each kind first appears when and where the kind most like it already lives. Different kinds of living creatures seem to emerge from one another, to evolve out of one another. Have I made my case? He asks. Isn't the living world as different from the material and quantum worlds as they are from each other, and so entitled to be thought of as a world on its own? My conclusion: concepts we use to explain what goes on in the living world should come from within the living world itself. 4. The genome. Established so far, we're not going to use physicalist terms. We're recognizing reality comes as distinct worlds, and one of these worlds is a separate world of life. From here on, by calling on what we know of the living world, of existing science, and our own experiences, each of us can make up our own origin story. In the following pages, I tell you mine, hoping if you don't like mine, you'll be inspired to come up with a story of your own. I I continue my story by introducing what I think is key to life. In the nucleus of every cell in every living creature's body, there's a long molecule or set of long molecules made up of smaller molecules joined end to end of a type referred to as DNA and RNA. The order those small molecules come in acts like writing. That writing spells out almost all the provisions needed for making that creature grow and maintaining it alive. All those provisions come written along that long molecule or set of molecules. That's the creature's genome. Genomes may come locked away in the nuclei of cells, but they act like independent living creatures. As cells divide, their genomes divide too, one copy finding its way into each new cell. Each creature gets its genome from its parents, so genomes pass down through the generations. Since life began 4 billion years ago, genomes have never stopped living and spreading from cell to cell and from each generation to the next. You'd think, he says, you'd think for something to be copied so often, it would have to be simple. Yet genomes are by far the most complex molecules we know about. Much more complex than any molecule special to our brains. The human genome consists of 3 billion of those smaller molecular units that act like letters of an alphabet. Translate that into a necklace strung 8 beads to an inch. It's fairly tight. 1 bead for each of those 3 billion letters. And that necklace, 3 billion beads long, would stretch from New York to Tokyo. 6,000 miles. It's a vast amount of information. Writing for 20,000 proteins takes up less than a 50th of it. We've nothing to compare that to tell us what it could be capable of. And it must all be necessary. Any we didn't need we'll have lost, as happens in free living creatures when they become parasites. The code for free living those creatures no longer need, their genomes lose. Oh. What is all that information needed for? Almost everything. Take how fur lies on the head of a cat. To ensure that their vision is unobstructed, hairs around their eyes are short and lie flat against the skin, all pointing away from each eye like petals of a flower. Hairs thin out in front of their ears, are absent inside the ears, are short and lie flat on the back. Hairs are absent on the cat's nose, and they're short around the mouth, except for a few long whiskers. So the cat's genome codes precisely for all the hairs covering the cat's face, the length, lie, density, and stiffness of every one. Now bear in mind that this precision and complexity of form applies to everything about the cat's body: its eyes, its senses of smell and taste, its heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, digestive enzymes, claw production, muscle attachments to bones, and so on. That could be more information than you'd need to send a rocket to Mars and back. Yet it's all there, written in the cat's genome. One particular device, key to the evolution of creatures like us, is the brain. Creatures like jellyfish have needs you can satisfy with a simple network of nerves. More complicated creatures like sea slugs come with networks of nerves looking more like subway maps that provide dedicated routes for signals to travel directly to where they're needed. In more evolved creatures, nerves congregate first as in insects into ganglions, knots of nerves where signals can be more efficiently sorted, then as in mollusks, into brains. The octopus has brains in its tentacles as well as in its head. Finally come creatures like us, with backbones and a single brain in a head that feeds signals down a spinal cord to carry out even more elaborate behaviors. Summary. Good. Genomes are special in having all the scripts needed to grow and maintain a living creature written along them, and they're immortal. They've been around without a break since life first began. As living creatures became more complicated, involving more scripts, the genomes carrying those scripts grew longer. So not much question. Genomes are going to have a lot to tell us about what's distinctive about living creatures. How they evolve, for example. Chapter 5. The genome thinks. I pointed out before how distinctively stuff comes organized in living creatures. How can what we know about genomes help us account for that? For example, how do the various parts of a body seem to know where they belong? They do seem to. Take a hydra, that's a little freshwater little creature about 1/8 of an inch long. Mash it into a clump of separate cells, and in a few days those cells will have reorganized themselves back into the hydra's original form, still alive, resuming its usual behavior. Each cell will have migrated back through physical space to where it belongs. In effect, it's as if each cell has a mind, able to read the other creature's minds, together forming a single group mind that knows the creature's original form and where each cell belongs in it. Here's another example. Cut a planaria worm, they're little short flatworms. Cut a planaria worm in half, and each half will figure out what's missing and grow it back precisely, including new eyes and brains in the right position in physical space. It's as if each part of the worm can tell what's missing and figure out what's needed to restore it. Some creatures can restore almost any part of their body they lose, even parts of their brains. Oh, wouldn't that be a nice trick? So, each cell in a creature's body seems to know what kind of a creature it's a part of. But if so, what part of each cell is doing this knowing? What else could that be but the genome? It's the only structure in a cell complex enough to know something. But this makes sense. Genomes, knowing what kind of creature they're part of, could account for how embryos, single cells, know how to grow in space and time into an entire adult. Well, they do, don't they? That's a lot of knowing. Does that much knowing amount to a mind? What would it mean for genomes to have a mind? I think it would mean that a genome can think. Could molecules like genomes think? What we know about ourselves says, yes, they could. You may object that a genome is just a molecule and molecules can't think. But our brains consist of only molecules, yet we can think. And the genome consists of far more complicated molecules than any in our brains. Also, it's been evolving for billions of years. Who can set any limit to what that's made it capable of? So yes, there's reason enough to conclude genomes could have minds. They could think. How far apart can genomes be and still communicate with one another? If they communicate with one another to manage the growth of entire creatures from an embryo, such as a whale, then they must be able to communicate over the adult whale's length of 100 feet. If genomes can reach each other's minds over distances of up to 100 feet, why not from one creature to another? This could account for how insects such as bees and ants show intelligence when gathered in a colony that they show little sign of as individuals. And we see creatures of entirely different kinds happily communicating. Ants and aphids work together as farmers and their livestock. Algae and fungi cohabit amicably as lichen. Well, they do, don't they? So, we see networks of genomes' minds appear to stretch among cells, like the Hydra, throughout individual living creatures, as in the growing whale, to colonies, to species, even to creatures of entirely different kinds. How far might this network extend? Maybe to a network of intelligence covering the entire living world. It's all one mind. Each node in the network would correspond to a distinct mind, managing the life served by that node and directing its evolution. Does this make any sense? Well, I'm not the first to come up with such a suggestion. The ancient Stoics believed in just such an intelligence. They believed it was such an intelligence that maintained creativity and order throughout the entire natural world. What made humans special, they said, was this august intelligence embedding in each of us a small portion of its majestic wisdom. They referred to this wisdom embedded in us as the microcosm, to the mighty intelligence in nature as the macrocosm. Microcosm and macrocosm, they said, Each reflected the other. What you wanted to find out about either of them, you could learn by studying the other. And this makes sense, I said here, and this makes sense. Before genomes could devise and embed minds in us, wouldn't they have had to evolve minds themselves? To come up with minds to give us, they'd probably draw on what they already knew about their own. Borrowing from the Stoics, we can expect to find genomes' minds similar to our own. Looking at evolution this way tells us it's not primarily about how living creatures evolve, it's about genomes. To really understand evolution, we need first to figure out how genomes evolved. At first, genomes seem to have evolved extremely slowly. For 1 billion years, living creatures were tiny and simple. It took another 1 billion years for a second kind of living creature to emerge from the first, also tiny and relatively simple. A further 1 billion or so years after that, one of one kind got lodged itself inside one of the others, resulting in a much more complicated cell with its genome confined within a nucleus. Those genomes developed complicated sex properties that provided evolution with separate channels, species, within which to innovate. That's the kind of cell that multicellular creatures like us are made of. What took so long? It may have taken that long, over 3 billion years, for genomes to evolve a mind. But once they did, they made up for lost time with a remarkable burst of creativity. In just 20 million years, they came up with almost all the kinds of complicated creatures we know about today. Then, within each kind, they set about creating a huge variety of even more complex creatures. Among them, very recently, came human beings. We have by far the biggest brains of creatures our size, and hands, vocal apparatus enabling us to speak, and a wonderful palette of thoughts and feelings. Yes? Since we come with feelings, does that mean that genomes do too? We know we get at least some of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors from our genome. In each of us at puberty emerge the feelings and urgings readying us for sex. We don't have to be taught that. Those feelings and urges develop in us naturally as a complex and coordinated program of feelings and behaviors. Those feelings, to appear in us, there must be corresponding code written along our genomes. If the genome can embed those mental abilities in us, I don't see how it could without possessing similar abilities itself. I don't see how, logically, we can deny feelings like ours to genomes themselves. Well, what can I say? I don't know. Did I write this? I did. Look, Chapter 6, How Evolution Works. There's a little subhead here, a new theory of evolution. Okay, Ready? Nowadays, biologists trace how living creatures evolved by studying their genomes. It's by what's written along those genomes that they tell species apart. They refer to stretches of writing along a genome as genes. When one species evolves into another, they say that's essentially due to changes happening in their genes. So if it's genes that drive evolution, they must be able to make changes to the genes they carry code for, the very same molecules they consist of. Even if genes come with minds, how could those minds make changes to the molecules those genomes consist of? I suggest the same way we do. To commit something to memory, our minds make changes in our brain cells, something purely physical. Later we can draw on those purely physical brain cells to bring that information back to mind. Mind and brains are free to interact. Remember, they're the same stuff, just with different properties and processes. So what I'm suggesting is, it says here, all a genome has to do to evolve the living creature it codes for is just to think about it, bring code for the genes of that creature to mind, have new thoughts about it, those new thoughts registering back as changes to those genes, to the genome itself. Merely by thinking about it, a genome can evolve one kind of creature into another. Hey presto, simple as that. A new theory of evolution. Genomes can simply think new species into existence. And a new answer to the question that so puzzled Darwin, what is a species? My answer? A species is a thought in the mind of a genome. Wait a moment. Yes. By supposing a genome can think into existence new kinds of living creatures, am I invoking the supernatural? I know that's how making this connection between mind and matter can seem at first when applied to the genome, but remember, it's something that, as we register our thoughts in a purely physical brain tissue and later bring them back to mind, we're doing all the time. In us, mind and matter can freely interact. So why not in our genomes? They made us. Another little crosshead. How genomes work. Among life's processes, I include creatures' needs being paired with corresponding solutions. Bees' need for food for their young was satisfied by them evolving to produce honey. Another example, vertebrates emerging onto land from the sea needed amplification apparatus in their ears to help them hear better in air. The solution was for bones associated with the gills of fish to shrink and be moved up into the head and into position precisely in their ears. Both these innovations came about, I'm saying, by genomes thinking them up. Got any better ideas, it says here. What's involved in genomes being able to create innovations like this? First, they have to be able to read their creatures' minds. Well, they would, wouldn't they, since they made those minds? Being able to read their creatures' minds makes genomes aware of those creatures' needs. They then come up with solutions that they can think into their creatures as changed or new genes. That accounts for why genomes have grown to be so long over the course of evolution, as they wrote into themselves code for an unending flow of ingenious solutions to creatures' needs. We now know of two sets of causes for things happening in our universe. There's physics and there's mind. Recall my comparison of the Earth and Mars, how different the evolution of living creatures had made the Earth. I'm proposing that difference is because of minds, ours, and the genomes. Well, I don't know if I can follow this. How did I get here? Maybe I'm going to have to read it again so I can follow along once I know where he's going. Chapter 7. Whoa, really? Back to common sense, perhaps? Am I serious? Genomes can think? Well, what makes a living creature, a mammal like you, able to think? Isn't that rather odd when you reflect on it? Aren't you made of the same basic stuff as everything else? What makes you able to think? What's your answer? Think of what I'm proposing in this book as an as-if theory. How the world appears, including how we experience ourselves. It's as if my theory is true. That's like Richard Dawkins talking about the selfish gene. He didn't mean genes really are selfish. He meant that the way evolution looks is as if genes are selfish. I'm saying something similar, except where he says genes are selfish, I'm saying genomes can think. I don't think that's the same. The way the world looks to me, it's as if genomes have minds and can think new species into existence and embed minds into us. Well, where else could they come from, I suppose? Why do I care? I want a worldview that's consistent, that can account for both how the outside world looks and how it feels inside to think and be conscious. Then, what's the problem? It's the concepts available to us coming clumped together in theories devised to tell other stories. What I'm trying to do is pull those concepts apart and reconnect them in a way that can account better for all of what I experience. Is my theory unscientific? True, we haven't yet made all the scientific discoveries needed to confirm it, I'd say. But it's rational enough. It's as rational as the alternatives. Is that true? So, am I serious? I can testify. My theory works for me. It's given me a greater appreciation of the world around me and a grander sense of my place in it. For me, in a world dominated by material technology, that's felt like progress. Chapter 8. The World of Mind. In my set of distinct worlds, once minds evolved, change could happen in different ways. One way is physical processes acting on physical objects. Another is mental. Mental processes also can drive changes in the physical world. He's going to have to explain that. But how? How can thoughts that are part of mind drive change in what's physical, like our minds telling our bodies what to do? Physical things don't need to be told how to change. They're changed because of physical processes outside them that exist throughout the universe that make them change. But for a mind to be equipped to change, it has to come with its own universe, its own account of the world around it, and a set of processes specifying how it can change in that world. In effect, each living creature carries an entire universe along with it, like a snail carrying its shell. It's through this shell, information it gets from its genome, that a mind interacts with the physical universe around it. So give us an example. Take an insect, for example. Almost all the information it needs is in its genome. Moths and butterflies pass through several very different stages, from an egg through a series of caterpillar instars to a pupa to an adult. At each stage, its genome provides it with the appropriate worldview and lifestyle. I'm going to read this chapter again. Take an insect, for example. Almost all the information it needs comes to it from its genome. Moths and butterflies pass through several very different stages, from an egg through a series of caterpillar instars to a pupa to an adult. At each stage, its genome provides it with the appropriate worldview and lifestyle, along with the appropriate senses and impulses. Some kind of brain registers the creature's needs and equips its body to satisfy them. That's an illustration of minds coming with their own universes or shells of meaning. We humans, it says here, come with our own shell of meaning. As infants, we come with satisfactions for many of our needs already transcribed out of our genomes into our brains. There they can work automatically without us having to be aware of them. Breathing, for example. There it is. For example, they can manage our breathing and our hearts beating. They can even manage our habits for us. We can find ourselves driving an automobile automatically while thinking about something else. Chapter 9. Consciousness and Creativity. So our minds get from our genome a shell of meanings we can draw on to act meaningfully in the physical world. We come with tons of meaning embedded in us by our genome. Let's refer to that thinking as autonomic. It's sometimes called the quick way. That's one way we can think. But we humans may be unique in having a second way we can think, and it involves consciousness. Of course, to help me think about consciousness and what's distinctive about it, I borrow concepts from the Stoics. For me, their macrocosm corresponds to the intelligence and creativity of the genome mind. Their microcosm corresponds to the intelligence and creativity, the genome mind embedded in each one of us. And just as their macrocosm and microcosm reflected each other, so will genome and human minds. That means we can learn more about ourselves by studying the genome mind, and more about the genome mind by looking into our own. Let's give that a try. Genomes make species evolve by thinking about them. So for the genome, thinking goes along with something evolving. Can we apply that to ourselves? Could thinking in us involve something evolving? How about thoughts? Could some of our thinking consist of thoughts evolving as they do in genomes' minds? One thought evolving into another, that thought evolving into another, and so on. Thinking like that, being driven by something evolving, could be very different from autonomic thinking. Why could it be different? Because genomes thinking like that to evolve new species, it's what makes them hugely creative. Did they pass some of that creativity onto us? Can we recognize some of that creativity in how we think? I think so. Sometimes we do feel creative, as if we can create genuine novelties. And it's true. Just look at the different kinds of bridges engineers keep dreaming up and building. Physical novelties of a kind that's entirely new. So yes, we can think creatively as genomes do. It's how we built culture and created civilization. How can we tell when we're thinking this way? By what we experience. As I can testify from my own experience and what I gather from reports by others, it's when we're being creative that we experience consciousness. Thinking creatively comes associated somehow with consciousness. Yeah. I've given a long example here in the book, and I'm leaving it out because it's a little bit too difficult to read. Okay. Here's something else that happens as I engage in creative thinking. A relaxing of physical determinism. Whoa! I seem to gain some control over physical matter. For example, I can look deliberately wherever I choose. As I do, my physical body registers what I choose to look at and brings it into focus. What's happening is muscles attached around the lenses in my eyes are stretching and relaxing in response to my conscious decisions. This is just one example of how, while thinking consciously, we exert control over physical matter. In this case, those muscles in each eye and the shape of the lens itself. Can we now carry those insights back over to the genome? In us, thinking associated with something evolving induces consciousness. If what's true of us is also true of the genome, genomes too will experience consciousness as they think. That, I'm going to suppose, is why it took so long for genomes to create creatures with minds. The global networked genome mind had to evolve not just to think, but to become conscious. Only then could it create, in a mere 20 million years, so many kinds of multicelled living creatures, and then figure out how to equip those creatures with minds of their own. And finally, to embed in us minds capable, like its own, of creativity and consciousness. Consciousness and creativity stand revealed as the primary powers of evolution. Needs can be satisfied in the physical world. A river can smooth out its flow by scouring out a wider riverbed for itself, and needs of living creatures can similarly induce solutions that way. By taking the same route repeatedly, they can beat a path. But only when genomes became conscious with the creativity that accompanied it could they proactively sense creatures' needs and satisfy them on a huge scale, creating the magnificent creatures we know today. All this confirms for me that there's a world of mind separate from the physical mind, and my experiences tell me the two worlds involving such different processes can interact. In order to recall the little passage that I didn't give you, so I could write about them here, I consciously rehearsed them a few times to impress them in memory, in brain cells, something purely physical. To write about them here, I was able to consciously access that memory in physical form and bring it back into consciousness. That distinction, that there could be mental processes different from physical processes, I think couldn't arise in a deterministic, purely physical world. In such a world, I don't think we could wonder if someday we'll figure out how the worlds of mind and matter can interact. But for now, what's more important is our experience shows us that they can. Chapter 10. Changing our minds. This section is about managing the information our minds come with. Most of it, what it takes to run a living body, digestion, for example, we don't have to worry about. All we need to care about is what we can be conscious of, that we can consciously change. What does that consist of? We humans didn't evolve already conscious, rather we evolved with just talents we'd need to make ourselves conscious over time, things like language, the sciences and the arts, culture. So our universe of evolutionary processes comes not only with the genome we're born with, but also with the culture we absorb as we grow up, and then whatever we add to it personally. Good. Thinking about mind and consciousness as having evolved can cut through a lot of old clutter. Let's do some house cleaning. Subhead: Free will and determinism banish. Are we determined by our genome? No, the opposite. Without our genome, we wouldn't exist. It, along with the rest of the embryo, made us, made everything about us that could give us freedom. I can't imagine anywhere else we'd get our freedom from. But we are made of matter. Does that make us determined according to today's laws of physics? Not, of course, complete freedom from physics. We can't fly just by waving our arms, but are we free to any extent to arrive at decisions within our minds and make physical things happen to carry them out? I think so. Suppose for a moment that everything was purely physical. Everything happened deterministically according to physical laws. Surely then we couldn't have evolved able to imagine anything being non-physical. But we can imagine that because that's how we experience consciousness. Say, if you believe it, I experience consciousness as being non-physical, and you've shown that your brain can access experience in a non-physical mental world. That world of mind is where free will would exist. Seems to me we can assume we have some degree of free will until someone proves we haven't. And physics hasn't managed to do that yet. Note, all we need is some degree of free will. Let's abandon the all or nothing free will determinism distinction and use another word for free will: volition. Next head. Consider volition instead. What difference does it make that we're conscious? We can create novelty. When thinking autonomically without consciousness, we can distinguish red and yellow from green to know when to pick fruit that's ripe, for example. But when we're thinking consciously, we may grind rocks to give us red and yellow pigments to paint a landscape involving sunset. Consciousness allows us to create in our mind's eye the picture before we paint it. To help us think about all this, I settled on the word volition. I use this to include the jumble of words we use for conscious thinking, such as creativity, rationality, judgment, and decision-making. Being able to say if and when, and having some degree of free will. We can consciously conceive of something novel and implement it in the physical world. Then, when we want to change our minds, all we need to concern ourselves with is our volition resource pool. Everything that can contribute to our volition, to what inclines us to choose to do or think something. It's anything that influences how our conscious mind works and what it feels like. Next little subhead, more ideas we're better off without. Okay? I've already disposed of ideas we're better off without. We're entirely physically determined, mind and matter can't interact. Gone. Once we abandon the physicalist's purely physical mechanism of evolution, Darwinism, here are some other ideas we can dispose of. Creatures evolve by adapting to the environment. Of course, any theory of evolution has to account for creatures being adapted to their environment, but is that enough? In an environment of rocks and pebbles, wouldn't that mean evolving to become more like rocks and pebbles? Instead, living creatures evolve to become less and less like the physical environment, more like energy distributors, entropy generators. Us evolving merely to adapt to the environment sells us short by a mile. We are much more wonderful than that. Adapting to life on the African savanna didn't prepare us for driving at 70 miles per hour at night on country roads lit only by headlights. Here we are, another thing we can abandon. Evolution is driven by creatures competing to survive. Collaboration is more potent than competition. Even wolves collaborate in hunting and nurturing the whole pack's cubs. Another one. What evolves are weapons for in-group competition. Probably not important. What evolves are new ways of doing things that we invent and learn from one another. And how about the other half of today's theory of evolution, genetic mutation? Once we drop that, we can forget about evolution requires random damage, mutations, to our genome for natural selection to select among. Look, if I can contribute to the evolution of other species by donating money to a Save the Animals fund, I can certainly contribute to the evolution of my own species without having to have my genes damaged. How should such origin stories as Darwin's be judged? Well, that's neo-Darwinism. Perhaps by their implications. By that standard, Darwin's purely physical mechanism has been a disaster, endorsing determinism and fatalism while diverting our attention away from evolution's creative powers. Perhaps we should first arrive at the implications we want our theories to embody, based on the evidence of all appearances, and then build our story around them. That's what I've aimed to do here. Having cleaned house, let's look for some new ideas. Chapter 11. Become 3% more conscious. Supposedly, it's a sign of intelligence if you recognize what you see in a mirror as a reflection of yourself. In my mid-teens, I went one step further. Seeing myself in a mirror, I said to myself, "That's me over there. I'm conscious of myself." Then I thought, can I use this to make myself more conscious? "I'm conscious of being conscious," I said. Then, "I'm conscious of being conscious of being conscious." Then, "I'm conscious of being conscious of being conscious of being conscious." And I waited to see if uttering that rigmarole had made any difference, but I didn't look or feel any different. I resolved to look for other ways to make myself more conscious. Can this book's new way of thinking about how we evolved help us do that? Little crosshead. Origin of consciousness. From what I know about paleontology, I've concluded our species wasn't conscious at first 200,000 years ago. Instead, we evolved with only the means of making ourselves conscious over time. First came language, then maybe gradually over the past 100,000 years, from reading Julian Jaynes' Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, great book, I've concluded that we began the process of becoming conscious only with the appearance of major civilizations about 5,000 years ago. Consciousness like ours arose only when the invention of alphabetic writing allowed us to record our thoughts for others to read back later as if we spoke them. About 3,000 years ago. That would be around 30 of today's lifetimes ago. Can we continue that pace, increasing the reach of consciousness within our lifetime by 3%? Yeah. Let's see what's involved. I'm going to talk of first meanings, then tools. Meanings. We come into the world already equipped to find meaning in it. For example, we're born with several dozen cells in our brains that label things around us with directions and distances of them from us, and several dozen cells that analyze faces and help us recognize each other. We're born with capabilities for memory, sensation, prediction, decision-making, doubt. We come into the world with a whole lot of equipment helping us think. Consciously drawing on this machinery, we can then, by association and contradiction, by reason and logic, by seeking answers to questions, by linking causes to their effects, come up with new meanings. Here's an example. Mother and father may be among the first meanings we form. From them we can construct motherland and fatherland. The former motherland, the country where our mothers nurtured us. The latter fatherland, the territory our fathers call on us to defend. We augment meanings like those through education and cultural creativity. As long as we live, our stock of meanings continues to grow. We add more as we need them. That's meanings. Tools. By tools, I mean major mental innovations like writing, coming up with metaphors, memorization techniques, mathematics, logic, the scientific method, taxonomy. Where do such tools come from? Some come from advances in technology, such as the internet, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality. My favorite source of new tools is revolutions in natural philosophy, in how we think the world is put together. Hey, isn't that what I say I've come up with? What I've been talking about here? What tools might that inspire us to create? In previous sections, I drew on wisdom of the ancient Stoics, on their intuition of a mind responsible for all the creativity and order in nature, and of that mind embedding some of its mental powers in us. Perhaps by contributing our discovery of the genome and evolution to their tradition of wisdom, we can extend that tradition into the future, discovering in our turn new tools for thinking and becoming more conscious. Where might we begin? We usually think of evolution as being about where we came from. But if genomes had to evolve first, they may have evolved through a much more fundamental natural process. From the living creatures they create being so wonderful, we can appreciate how powerful that process must be. How powerful must the mental tools of genomes be, generated by the process through which they evolved? Can we tap into those tools? Suppose we regard genomes as parts of the living world, as persons. Suppose we study living creatures for the ingenuity in their genomes implied by how they evolved, what you might call engines of evolution. By incorporating these mental engines into our minds, we might succeed in passing on to future generations some of the genome's awesome mental powers. What would those future generations be like? How would they develop those powers? We don't have to wait and see. I can just imagine it by coming up with a story. In the original little book, I did include a story in which I illustrate this, but it's long and it doesn't really belong in here. If you want it, you can go to the playlist in my channel's articles and you'll find the story there, and it's called Children of the Genome. Chapter 13. Chapter 12 was the story I recorded separately. Conclusions. Are you revolution ready? If so, let's go. Be prepared for a long, hard slog. As far as concepts go, we may have to start from scratch. Ancient world wisdom culminated in Christianity, with a God giving each of us a soul. Any questions? Refer to his book, the Bible. Then came science, inherently blind to mind and consciousness, when, just a couple of lifetimes ago, we realized we'd evolved, there were no obvious traditions to draw on to explain how that worked and how it could have made us conscious. Is that a property of matter, like gravity? Or is it a creation of the process of evolution? itself. Coming up with all the necessary concepts could be as challenging as coming up with quantum theory turned out to be. For inspiration, how wide a net should we cast? It has to extend beyond the sciences. The humanities, of course. Perhaps we should relax any knee-jerk rejection we have of creationism or any other religious tradition. They've often been stewing over the same issues for a much longer time. What form should proposed origin stories take? Must they take the form of rational arguments, advancing step by rational step, as I've tried to do? Must they exclude any supernatural entities? But would that exclude my calling on the Stoic relation between microcosm and macrocosm? What kind of origin story would be acceptable to a scientifically aware but broadly cultured audience? Can it take the form of traditional myth? Whatever form our origin story takes, it'll land us on a battlefield. The issue? The appearances of consciousness and creativity in us and the rest of nature. At one extreme are physicalists rallying behind the banner of neo-Darwinism, the purely physical mechanism for evolution that they claim validates their beliefs, demanding we blind ourselves to those appearances and deny them. At the other extreme are creationists insisting on the reality of those appearances and that we take them as proof for the existence of the Christian God. For a lifetime, since the modern revival of Darwinism, the rest of us have lain low, waiting for the storm to blow over, wanting no part of either side. What we want is simply acknowledgement of those appearances, consciousness and creativity, and a common-sense explanation of them we can live with, even draw on, to flourish. What's at stake couldn't be any bigger. Meaning in life, something notably lacking in today's world. Can finding a role for mind in evolution make us any happier? Certainly yes, compared to believing everything about us is purely physical, that our conscious thoughts can have no consequences. Am I suggesting nature worship? That's a good start. First acknowledge how marvelous nature is, then adore the agent behind it that created us. The intelligent genome? As good an object of worship as any. Think of such worship as makeup for the mind, a way of appearing more wonderful to ourselves. Where might coming up with such a new origin story lead us next? To further sources of meaning and value, leading in turn to new lifestyles, new economies, new community relations, and eventually to humans becoming children of the genome.